This is one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in Savannah, Georgia. Before we start, please let me know where you're watching from and what time it is right now in the comments. We want to know where and when these documented accounts go. A painting of a young man was found in the attic of the Sorrel Weed House in Savannah, Georgia, one of the city's most famous historical mansions, in the winter of 1852. The picture showed a young man smiling and looking happy, even though he was wearing formal clothes that weren't typical for someone of his apparent station. The local historical society was not interested in the painting's quality, which was very good. Instead, they were interested in the small inscription in the bottom right corner that read, Elijah Brown, property of the Winston estate. This one line would eventually solve a case that the people of Savannah would try to forget for more than a century. At first glance, the painting didn't stand out. It was an oil-on-canvas painting about 20 inches by 16 inches that showed a young black man with an unusual smile. His eyes, on the other hand, seemed to follow people around the room, which was a common trick used by skilled portrait painters of the time. It was strange that this painting showed slaves, because formal portraits of slaves were rare in the Antebellum period, especially not with the respect shown to this subject. The Savannah Historical Society's records show that the painting was first listed as Portrait of Unknown Young Man and put away with a lot of other artifacts from the city's pre-Civil War era. People didn't really care about the painting until 1873, more than 20 years after it was found. While taking pictures for the Historical Society's archives, a researcher named Thomas Hardwick, who is working on a complete record of Savannah's architectural history, saw the portrait. In 1965, while the Georgia Historical Society building was being renovated, workers found Hardwick's journal entries. In one of them he wrote, "The young man's eyes have a strange quality, not quite sadness, not quite acceptance, something else entirely, as though he knows something the viewer does not." Hardwick's interest took him to the Winston estate, which by that time had changed hands several times and was now owned by the Carmichael family. The estate, which was about 7 miles outside of Savannah's historic district, was starting to fall apart by that time. The original Winston family lost most of their money during the Civil War, and the people who owned the property after that didn't have the money to keep it up. County records from 1873 show that Hardwick was allowed to look through the estate's remaining papers, which were mostly stored in a small building that had once been the overseer's home. Hardwick found a small leather-bound book, about 5 inches by 7 inches, with no title on the cover. It was among tax records, ledgers, and other business letters. Inside were detailed records of the slaves on the Winston plantation, including their names, ages, parents, if known, and most disturbingly, their market values. Hardwick found the entry for Elijah Brown on page 37 of this ledger. It said, male, age 23, born on property to Martha, deceased, educated as an experiment, exceptional aptitude for numbers and letters, potential value as a clerk or house servant, $800. Hardwick noticed the phrase, educated as an experiment. Before the Civil War, this kind of education was rare and often against the law in many southern states. Another entry from the 12th of October, 1851 said, E.B. continues to exceed expectations, has begun maintaining secondary ledgers with minimal supervision, demonstrates remarkable recall of business transactions. Experiment appears successful. Then, on December 3 of the same year, there was a more troubling entry that said, concerns regarding E.B.'s growing awareness of his circumstances. Began asking questions about his mother's circumstances and fate. Winston suggests tempering education with reminder of station. Hardwick's investigation into Elijah Brown could have concluded at that juncture had he not met an elderly woman named Sarah Jenkins during his third visit to the former Winston estate. Hardwick's journal says that Jenkins worked as a housekeeper at the estate when she was a child and remembered Elijah Brown. Hardwick's account of her story is the first detailed description of the man outside of the portrait and ledger entries. Mr. Elijah wasn't like the others, Jenkins told Hardwick. Master Winston had him brought into the house when he was just 7 years old after his mama passed. Said he had a look in his eyes, a kind of knowing, taught him his letters and numbers himself, which wasn't done in those days. By the time Mr. Elijah was 15, he was keeping all the books for the estate. Master Winston would show him off to visitors sometimes, like he was a trained animal doing tricks. Mr. Elijah would smile and demonstrate his abilities with numbers, calculating sums faster than educated men could with paper and pencil. But when the visitors left, that smile would go away. His eyes turned different then. Jenkins went on to say that Winston had asked for the portrait in early 1852 and told Elijah to keep his company's smile on during the sittings. Master made him practice that smile for weeks before the painter came, Jenkins said. He said he wanted to show his friends what could be done with the right training. The painter came from Charleston and stayed for 3 days. Mr. Elijah smiled the whole time and never broke. But at night, when he was sleeping in the small room off the kitchen, I could hear him talking to himself in whispers and writing things I couldn't understand. The estate's records say that the portrait was finished in April 1852. Hardwick's research showed that Winston hung the painting up in his study where everyone could see it. He often used it to start arguments with guests about how smart slaves were, which was a controversial topic even among slave owners. But what happened in the months after the portrait was finished would turn a strange historical footnote into something much more disturbing. County records show that Winston said Elijah had escaped in August 1852. The Savannah Republican newspaper ran a reward notice on August 17th that read, "Runaway educated Negro man, answers to Elijah, age 24. Can read and write well. May try to pass off correspondence as written by a white man. $100 reward for return to Winston Estate." The notice ran for 3 weeks in a row before it was taken down. There are no more public records that talk about Elijah's escape or capture. Hardwick might have thought that Elijah had made it safely to the north if he hadn't found a number of strange entries in Winston's personal diary, which had been kept separate from the plantation records. The diary, which was covered in faded red leather and had the years 1852 to 1854 embossed on the spine, had entries that got more and more random, starting in late August 1852, just a few days after the first runaway notice appeared in the newspaper. The entry from August 20th says, "E did not escape as reported. Necessity required fabrication following discovery of his private writings. Contents too disturbing to detail here. Have secured him in the old storage cellar while determining appropriate course of action. Sarah instructed to inform all that he has run off north." A subsequent entry dated August 25th provides a more troubling glimpse into the situation. E's confinement continues. He shows no remorse, maintains that his calculations were correct. The ledgers he kept in secret suggest systematic discrepancies going back 3 years. Funds diverted, transactions recorded incorrectly. The extent of his deception is yet unknown. More concerning are his writings about the others. He has been watching us as we watched him, recording observations, weaknesses. When questioned, he simply smiles. The same smile as in the portrait. It unsettles me greatly. In the weeks that follow, the diary entries become more and more focused on Elijah. Winston said he couldn't sleep because he thought he heard whispers coming from the locked cellar. He wrote on September 10th, "Sarah and 2 others say they've seen E in the main house at night, even though the cellar door is locked. This is impossible, of course. But the ledgers in my study show new entries in his unique handwriting. This must be a trick of the mind. I've increased the guard at night anyway." The last time Elijah was mentioned in the diary was on October 3rd. "The matter with E has been resolved permanently. The cellar is sealed. The portrait will be taken down from the study and destroyed." Sarah was fired for spreading rumors among the others. "I must now focus on reviewing all accounts and business dealings of the past 3 years to assess the damage done." Hardwick's research shows that Winston's money problems got worse very quickly after this entry. By the beginning of 1853, he had sold a number of slaves and pieces of land. Letters he wrote to his bankers in Savannah show that he was getting deeper into debt and had trouble explaining the differences in his accounts. In a letter from the Bank of Savannah dated February 1853, it says, "The inconsistencies in your recent submissions cannot be attributed to simple accounting errors. The pattern suggests deliberate misrepresentation spanning multiple quarters. The bank must insist on immediate clarification and full repayment of all outstanding sums. We don't know what Winston said in response to this letter, but records show that by June 1853, he had sold all of his property in Savannah and moved to a much smaller estate near Augusta, Georgia. The Winston family, which used to be very important in Savannah, basically disappeared from society. Winston was supposed to destroy the picture of Elijah, but somehow it ended up at the Sorrel Weed House, where it was found during renovations almost a year later. Hardwick's investigation might have ended there if he hadn't decided to look at the old Winston estate one last time before he was done. In his journal entry from the 7th of July, 1873, he wrote, "Returned to the Winston property today to clarify several points regarding the architectural modifications made during the 1842nd. The current caretaker, a Mr. Reynolds, permitted me to examine the lower levels of the main house, which have remained largely untouched since the Winston family's departure. Among the various storage rooms and wine cellars is a curious space. A small room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with no windows and a door that appears to have been sealed and then reopened at some point. The walls are unusually thick, and the room sits apart from the other basement chambers. When I inquired about its purpose, Reynolds seemed uncertain, suggesting it might have been a secure storage area for valuables." Hardwick goes on to describe his examination of this room. The space is empty now, save for a small desk against one wall. The desk appears significantly older than the other furnishings I've observed in the house. Upon closer inspection, I discovered that the inside of the drawer contains writings carved directly into the wood with what must have been a sharp, narrow implement. The text is tiny, precise, and covers every available surface inside the drawer. Much of it appears to be columns of numbers similar to accounting entries, but without any contextual labels to indicate what is being counted or calculated. Interspersed among these figures are passages of text, written in an educated hand that suggests the writer was well versed in the conventions of written English. Hardwick wrote in his journal that he copied some of these passages into his notebook. The biggest part that was readable said, "They think the portrait only shows my face." The artist was good, but not very observant. He didn't see how I studied him in return, learning his technique. He didn't know that with each brushstroke, he was making not just an image, but a window. Winston sees only what he wants to see, a carefully crafted specimen that confirms his worldview. He doesn't see how the ledgers speak to me, how numbers reveal truths that words hide. 3 years of patience, 3 years of watching and recording, 3 years of smiling. The calculations are done now. The changes have been made. Even if they find out how I did it, the damage is done, and I will keep smiling from the frame, watching as understanding dawns. Hardwick's last journal entry about Elijah Brown shows how uneasy he is becoming with the case. I keep going back to the portrait, which is still in storage at the Historical Society. At first, I thought the subject's expression was just a simple smile, but now it seems to convey something more complex, a kind of knowing satisfaction. I pressed the Society about the possibility of displaying the portrait in the upcoming exhibition on Savannah's pre-war period, but she was hesitant, saying that several staff members have requested that the painting stay in storage because they find it unsettling. Maybe it's just suggestion working on my mind after I found out about the strange circumstances surrounding its creation, but I can't shake the feeling that the young man in the portrait is indeed watching, not from the past, but somehow from a continuous present, still observing and recording our reactions to his image. The Georgia Historical Society kept Hardwick's research notes and journal after he died in 1881. The portrait stayed in storage until 1927, when it was shown for a short time as part of an exhibit on African American history in Georgia. Exhibition records show that the painting was taken down after only 3 days because both staff and visitors said they felt like they were being watched or followed by the subject's gaze. The curator's notes say that one old visitor, whose name is not known, became very upset when he saw the portrait and said, "That's him! That's the Winston boy!" Still smiling after all these years. The portrait was put back in storage, where it was mostly forgotten until 1958, when Professor James Mercer of Emory University started looking into cases of educated slaves in the antebellum South. Mercer's notes, which were published in the Journal of Southern History in 1960, talked about the portrait of Elijah Brown as a great example of how some slave owners, even though most people at the time thought differently, saw, and even encouraged the intellectual abilities of the people they enslaved, though usually for their own gain, rather than out of concern for their well-being. Mercer set up a photo shoot of the portrait for his research, but in letters to the Historical Society, he said that the first photos didn't do a good job of showing the subject. Mercer said that the second attempt made pictures that were strangely distorted, especially around the eyes and mouth. It seems that the third try worked, because black and white pictures of the portrait are in Mercer's published article, even though the reproduction isn't very good by today's standards. The Georgia Historical Society building was being worked on a lot in 1964, which was the strangest part of Elijah Brown's portrait's strange history. The portrait and many other items were moved to a climate-controlled storage facility in Atlanta for a short time. The transfer inventory says that the painting was put in a custom crate and loaded onto a truck on the 12th of March 1964. The receiving inventory at the Atlanta facility, on the other hand, says that the crate was empty when it arrived and that Item A, 347 portrait oil on canvas, circa 1852, missing. Crate sealed and undamaged. Inquiry initiated. There was never an explanation for why the painting went missing, and after a few months, the Historical Society filed an insurance claim for the lost item. If it weren't for a strange event at the old Winston estate, Elijah Brown's portrait might have been lost to time or theft, along with many other historical items. The Savannah Historical Preservation Trust bought the property in May 1965. Since the Winston family left, it had changed hands many times. They planned to turn it into a museum about plantation life in Georgia before the Civil War. During the first inspection of the property, workers found that the small room in the basement that Hardwick wrote about had been sealed off, with the door bricked over and plastered to match the walls around it. The renovation foreman said that they might never have found the room if one of the workers hadn't heard a slight change in the sound when they tapped along the basement wall. The trust decided to reopen the sealed room as part of their restoration efforts after looking at the original architectural plans, which showed that there was a space behind the wall. Workers took down the brick and plaster wall that had been blocking the room for what architects thought was about 100 years, based on the materials used and how it was built. The Trust's official report describes what they found in clinical terms. The previously sealed space contained a small wooden desk against the north wall. Consistent with descriptions in Hardwick's notes from 1873, the desk drawer contained extensive carving on interior surfaces, as previously documented. No other furnishings were present. The south wall of the room, opposite the desk, displayed a rectangular area of discoloration, approximately 20 inches by 16 inches, suggesting that an item of similar dimensions had been hung there for a considerable period, protecting that portion of the wall from the discoloration that affected the surrounding area. The official report doesn't say anything about the desk drawer's condition, but Margaret Wilkins, the Trust's lead historian, does in her personal journal. The carvings that Hardwick wrote about had grown a lot. The whole surface is now covered in tiny writing, which goes all the way to the sides and bottom of the drawer. Before, he only wrote about calculations and a few passages of text. What is most disturbing is that parts of this text talk about things that happened long after the room was supposed to be sealed, such as Hardwick's research, the 1927 exhibition, and even Mercer's attempts to take pictures in 1960. The last entry, carved into the bottom right corner of the drawer, is from the 13th of March 1964, the day after the portrait was packed up to be moved to Atlanta. It says simply, "I have learned enough. It is time to leave this frame." Wilkins' diary shows that she only told 2 other members of the trust about her find because she was afraid that publicity would draw attention to what must be a very complicated hoax. The 3 agreed to write down all the carvings in detail, but they would not include the strange ones in official reports. The desk was taken out of the room and put in a safe place that has not been made public. It is said to still be there. The painting of Elijah Brown has never been found. In 1967, the case was officially closed, and the insurance company paid out the painting's assessed value of $800. This was the same amount that Elijah was worth in the Winston Plantation ledger over 100 years earlier. In 1968, while doing a routine inventory of artifacts at the Georgia Historical Society, an archivist found that Hardwick's original research materials on Elijah Brown were missing from where they were supposed to be stored. The catalog entry that went with it had been crossed out, and there was a note in the margin that said, "Deaccessioned the 13th of March 2064. There is no record of any official deaccession, and no staff member who worked there at the time remembered taking the materials or making the note. The 13th of March 1964 is the same day the empty portrait arrived in Atlanta. In late 1968, the Winston Estate Museum project was finally dropped. The official reason given was structural problems and high restoration costs, but Wilkins' last journal entry about the property suggests another reason. "We've had 3 night watchmen quit in the past month. The last guard, Williams, a man I've known for years as level-headed and practical, said he heard a pen scratching on paper for hours, followed by what he called the sound of someone smiling. When I asked what he meant, he couldn't explain further, saying only, 'You'd know it if you heard it.'" The board's decision to abandon the project comes as a relief to those of us who know the whole story. The Winston estate was empty for many years, and it got worse over time. In 1987, it was torn down to make room for a residential subdivision. Everyone says they heard writing coming from the basement, specifically from the room we opened up, even though it's empty now. While digging for the development's infrastructure, workers found a small metal box where the basement of the main house used to be. County records show that the box only had one thing in it: a folded piece of paper with a detailed drawing of a smiling young man and the initials EB in the corner. The developer threw the item away because he thought it wasn't important, and construction went on as planned. Even though the housing market in the Savannah area was getting better, the subdivision, which was originally called Winston Estates after the property's history, had trouble filling its units. People who lived there said they had a lot of strange experiences, like hearing strange noises and feeling like they were being watched all the time, especially in homes that were built closest to where the original house used to be. In 1996, after years of falling property values, the development was given the name River Point Estates, and all references to the land's old name were taken out of marketing materials. In 2002, while workers were fixing up one of the oldest buildings in Savannah's historic district, they found a secret compartment in the wall of what used to be the bank manager's office. This building used to be a bank where Winston did business. There was a leather portfolio inside with dozens of pages of accounting books from 1849 to 1852. Experts said the handwriting was very neat and clear, and it listed hundreds of financial transactions, many of which had to do with the Winston estate. Forensic accountants found that there was a complicated system of small changes to different accounts. These changes were too small to be noticed on their own, but when they were all added up, they took a lot of money from the Winston holdings and put it into a number of anonymous accounts. The last entry, from the 19th of August 1852, the day before Winston wrote about putting Elijah in the cellar, said, "Calculations complete. Balance adjusted. Freedom purchased." The Georgia Historical Society got the ledgers as a gift, and they are still available for researchers to use. It's strange, but people who look at these documents often say they feel like someone is reading over their shoulder and watching how they react to the carefully recorded numbers that, more than 100 years ago, systematically took apart a man's fortune from inside his own home. Dr. Elena Hayes, an art history professor who specializes in 19th century portraiture, wrote the most disturbing ending to this story. In 1998, she was looking into the technical aspects of antebellum portrait techniques. As part of her research, she put together a database of portraits from the time, including works by Robert Winston Harding, the Charleston artist who is thought to have painted Elijah Brown's portrait. Hayes noticed something strange while looking at Harding's confirmed works in different collections across the South. A face kept showing up in the backgrounds of several paintings that were made after 1852. In a portrait of a Charleston merchant from 1853, a young black man can be seen through a window in the background, but he is hard to see. In a family photo from 1855, taken on a plantation near Beaufort, the same face can be seen among the household staff who are standing behind the family. In a painting from 1860 of a street scene in Richmond, Virginia, the face can be seen in a crowd of people walking by. Hayes' 2000 article in the American Art Journal says that the recurring figure fits the description of Elijah Brown. He is always in the scene as an observer and has the same distinctive smile that historical records say he had in his portrait. The Charleston Museum archives contain Harding's journals, which do not mention this recurring figure. What makes this case different is that the figure is never the subject or focus of the painting. Instead, he is always an observer in the scene, often placed in such a way that it looks like he is looking directly at the viewer instead of the main subjects. Hayes's research found the same face in 7 confirmed Harding paintings from 1853 to 1863. After that, Harding's career came to an end when he left painting and went to a sanitarium near Charleston. When asked about her findings, Hayes gave a careful answer. It's not uncommon for artists to reuse models or faces they've become comfortable rendering. The few records from the institution show that Harding had severe paranoia and thought he was being watched. He stayed there until he died in 1867. It is said that he refused to look at any paintings or mirrors in his last years because he thought he is watching from within the frames. The picture of Elijah Brown is still missing to this day. The Winston family line came to an end in the early 1900s. The ledgers, journals, and notes that record this strange case are spread out across different archives and collections, like pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. The description of that smile stands out the most. Winston made Elijah practice it for weeks before the portrait sitting. It was a smile that seemed to hold something back, as if the person looking at it didn't know what it was. Some historians have said that Elijah Brown's story is nothing more than an unusually well-documented case of a slave using the education his owner gave him to plan his own escape, which was a small victory against the cruel system of slavery. Some people say that the strange carvings in the desk drawer and the fact that the portrait went missing without any explanation are signs of something more disturbing. Visitors to the Georgia Historical Society sometimes ask about the painting of the smiling young man, even though it has been missing for more than 50 years. This is probably the most telling thing. When asked how they know about it, many say, "I saw it watching me from a frame on the wall." Staff always say that there is no such portrait on display anywhere in the building. The last known mention of Elijah Brown was in a security guard's journal from the late 1992 when he worked at the Historical Society. The entry from the 12th of November 1998 says, "Saw that portrait again tonight during rounds. Not hanging on any wall, just leaning against the storage room door from the inside. Same as last week. Maintenance says they found no painting when they checked tonight. I stopped and looked at it properly for the first time." The young man's smile seems different now. Satisfied somehow. Like someone who has successfully concluded a long project. I don't think I'll be seeing it again. He was right. The Historical Society has not heard of any more sightings of the portrait. But in museums, historic homes, and private collections in Savannah and beyond, visitors sometimes report a strange thing. The feeling that one of the faces in a centuries-old painting is looking back at them, always in the background, always watching, and always with the same knowing smile. Elijah Brown continues to watch the world that once tried to hold him back, as if he has learned to escape both his bondage and his frame. He is still recording, still calculating, and still smiling that practiced smile. Michael Collins, a graduate student, was looking into how people kept their books before the Civil War for his doctoral dissertation in 2003, when he found an odd pattern in the financial records of some well-known Savannah families who did business with the Winston estate. Collins observed that each family encountered inexplicable financial irregularities commencing around 1849 and persisting until approximately 1853, coinciding with the period during which Elijah Brown was managing the Winston ledgers. Collins wrote in his thesis, which was later published in the Journal of Economic History, "The pattern is remarkably consistent. Small changes to many accounts, usually no more than 1% or 2% of any one transaction, but done in a systematic way across hundreds of entries. The result was a big shift in capital that would be hard to see without modern computational analysis. The most interesting thing is that the money didn't just go away. It looks like they were sent to different places through a complicated series of transactions that ended up putting the money in several accounts at the Freedman Savings Bank, which was set up after the Civil War. By 1853, Collins thought that this method had taken about $25,000, which was a huge amount of money at the time and more than enough to buy freedom and start a new life somewhere else. But his research showed that there was no record of Elijah Brown ever buying his freedom, and there was no record of anyone matching his description accessing the funds in Freedman's bank records. A researcher found an unusual property deed from January 1858, almost 6 years after Elijah Brown's supposed escape or confinement, while digitizing the Savannah City archives in 2007. The deed showed that a E. Winston, who was described in the document as a free man of color, bought a small piece of land on the outskirts of Savannah at the time. There were a few things that made the transaction unusual. For one, it was uncommon for Black Americans to buy land in Georgia at this time. For another, the buyer's signature on the deed showed that they were more educated than most people at the time. Most importantly, the property was less than half a mile from the old Winston estate. Records from the survey show that E. bought the land. Winston had a small hill that gave him a clear view of the main house on the Winston property. The deed said that a small house with studio space for an artist would be built on the property, but city records show that no building was ever built there. The land stayed with E. Winston owned it until 1864, when the city took it back because Winston didn't pay his taxes. No more records of E. Winston doesn't show up in any Savannah records. In 2012, Dr. Camille Roberts, an art historian who studies hidden stories in Southern portraiture, wrote a paper that said Elijah Brown might have been more than just a smart bookkeeper. Her study of Hardwick's notes and the incomplete descriptions of the portrait show that he used techniques that weren't common among white artists at the time. Roberts said, "The description of the subject's gaze following viewers around the room suggests the artist used a specific technique for rendering eyes that creates this illusion. This technique was well known in European art, but not very common among American portrait painters of the time, with the notable exception of a few Black artists who had trained in Europe. The fact that Elijah Brown may have had some kind of artistic training or even worked with the artist who painted his portrait adds an interesting new angle to this case." In 2015, while restoring a historic home in Charleston, a letter from plantation owner Richard Hartwell to Francis Winston from 1850 was found. This letter gave Roberts's theory unexpected support. In the letter, Hartwell asks, "Has your experiment with the young man's artistic education yielded the results you anticipated?" Our mutual friend Harding speaks highly of his natural ability, particularly his grasp of perspective and the human form. I remain skeptical that such talents can be developed to a professional standard in one of his race, but would be most interested to view the results when next I visit Savannah. No response from Winston to this inquiry has been found, and no other documents directly confirm that Elijah received artistic training. The letter does, however, suggest that Winston's efforts to teach Elijah may have gone beyond reading and writing to include art lessons, possibly from the same Robert Winston Harding, who would later paint a picture of Elijah. In 2018, the Telfair Museums in Savannah got an anonymous gift of a small leather-bound sketchbook that changed the strange case again. The note that came with it said, "Found among my grandfather's things, believed to be connected to the E.B. case." At first, museum staff thought it was a 19th century artist's sketchbook with an unknown history, but when they looked more closely, they saw a small EB pressed into the leather on the back cover. There were dozens of detailed pencil drawings in the sketchbook, mostly studies of faces with different expressions. Based on the paper and materials used, art experts agreed that the sketches were made around the middle of the 19th century. The most interesting parts were the self-portraits of a young Black man with a calm, almost mysterious smile. His face matched what historical accounts said about Elijah Brown. The later pages were even more disturbing because they had very detailed drawings of the Winston family, their servants, and different visitors to the estate, all of whom were caught in private moments, like sleeping, arguing, or doing other things. The sketches looked like surveillance, with dates, times, and short notes about the subject's habits or weaknesses written on each one. The last few pages of the sketchbook had technical studies of how to paint portraits, with a focus on how to paint eyes. One page had a single cryptic note that said, "The frame is both prison and window. The observer can become the observed. The portrait can become a portal." Dr. Roberts, who was asked to look at the sketchbook, noticed that the techniques used in these drawings were similar to those used in the portraits where Hayes had said he saw Elijah's face in the background. Roberts wrote in her analysis, "If Elijah Brown got artistic training from Harding and really did make these sketches, It suggests a level of artistic ability that could explain some of the more mysterious parts of this case. The study of portraiture is, in essence, the study of how to capture a person's essence within a frame. For someone like Brown, whose personhood was legally denied, whose very self was considered property, mastering this art may have taken on profound additional dimensions. During an inventory of the Charleston Museum archives in 2021, staff found an unlabeled daguerreotype that had been mixed in with other things that weren't related. The picture, which was taken around 1853 using a certain photographic technique, showed the inside of what looked like an artist's studio. There was a man sitting at an easel with his back to the camera, but it was impossible to tell who he was from the picture. The easel held a portrait that was still being worked on. It showed a plantation scene with a family on a porch. In the background of the painting, barely visible, was a figure whose face, though small in the image, looked a lot like the descriptions of Elijah Brown. This daguerreotype is especially interesting because it seems to show one of the paintings Hayes found in her research that has Elijah's likeness in the background. The painting is from 1853 and is now in a private collection in Charleston. The picture looks like it was taken while the portrait was still being worked on, which means that the person who took it probably had access to Harding's studio while the work was being made. There is a handwritten note on the back of the daguerreotype that is so faded that it is almost impossible to read. Digital enhancement showed what looks like the words, "He watches as I work." Not I him, but he me. Researchers have gone back to look at the 7 Harding paintings that Hayes said had Elijah's likeness in the background since they were first found. Advanced imaging techniques have shown something that hadn't been seen before. In each painting, the eyes of the Elijah figures seem to be looking not just at the viewer, but also at the main subject of the portrait. Infrared analysis reveals that in several paintings, the primary subjects initially exhibited different facial expressions that were subsequently altered. The modifications rendered the subjects more susceptible, exposing character deficiencies or vulnerabilities. Dr. Roberts has put forward a theory that has drawn both supporters and critics in the academic world. She proposes that Elijah Brown may have attained a form of freedom not through escape or the acquisition of his liberty, but via a more unconventional method, by somehow integrating himself into Harding's works. The fact that his likeness keeps showing up in these works, always as an observer of the main subjects, could be an artistic signature or something deeper. A deliberate subversion of the very medium that was used to objectify him in his own portrait. This theory could account for Harding's subsequent psychological breakdown and his particular delusion of being observed from within frames. It could also explain the strange carvings found in the desk drawer at the Winston estate, which referred to events that happened long after the room was supposed to be sealed. Roberts says that if Brown had really studied art and had a close working relationship with Harding, he might have been able to change or even directly add to Harding's paintings. It can't easily explain why the portrait disappeared in 1964, or why people keep saying they see a young man with a unique smile in the backgrounds of paintings where he wasn't previously seen. A visitor to the High Museum in Atlanta in 2023 said they had an unsettling experience while looking at their collection of 19th-century American portraits. The visitor, an art history professor from Emory University, said that in a painting from 1860 of a Georgia judge, she saw a figure in the background that she hadn't seen before when she had studied the same painting for a research project. She said that through a window behind the judge's desk, she could see the face of a young black man with a big smile. His eyes were not on the judge, but on the viewer. Museum staff looked at the painting after she reported it and didn't find any such figure. Pictures taken of the work over the years showed that the background had not changed or been added to. The next day, when the professor came back to make sure of what she had seen, the figure was gone. Later, she told her coworkers, "I've spent my whole career studying these works. I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't there before." Other collections that have portraits from before the Civil War have also reported similar things. In every case, the descriptions of the unexpected figure are very similar. A young black man with an educated look and a smile that seems to show both satisfaction and secret knowledge. And in each case, a closer look at the paintings later shows no sign of the figure that was described. The stories from museum staff and conservators who work with these collections are probably the most disturbing. Some people have said they found small, almost microscopic notes on the backs of canvases or hidden in frames. These notes are written in tiny, precise handwriting that matches samples of Elijah's writing that have been kept in historical records. Most of the time, these notes only have a date and the initials EB on them, but the dates can be from the 1850 seconds to as recently as this decade. Earlier this year, the Georgia Historical Society got an anonymous package that looked like original accounting ledgers from the Winston estate that were made between 1849 and 1852. This was the most recent event in this strange case. The first checks show that the documents are real, even though they weren't known to be in any archive or collection before. The ledgers have the usual records of plantation business, but they also have small, detailed notes written in a different hand than the main entries. These notes are about the Winston family, their guests, their weaknesses, and their secrets. The last pages have something even stranger: detailed instructions for making pigments and preparing canvases, and then what looks like a recipe for a certain kind of varnish. The last entry, from the 18th of August, 1852, 2 days before Winston wrote that Elijah was locked in the cellar, says simply, "The portrait will be done tomorrow, and so will I." There was a single sheet of modern paper with a typed message that said, "He is still watching, still recording, still calculating." The portrait was never the prison he escaped from. It was the door through which he left. Researchers are still looking into the different documents, artifacts, and stories that have to do with Elijah Brown and his strange portrait. Some people think the whole thing is just a bunch of coincidences, misunderstandings, and embellishments of what was probably a simple story about an educated slave who either escaped or died in a more tragic way at the hands of his owner. They say that there is no one piece of evidence that would prove the more unusual theories about the case. Some people see Elijah's story as something deeper, a story about watching and being watched, and how people who society sees as objects can become subjects on their own terms. In this view, Elijah's possible artistic talents and the fact that he was good with numbers gave him the tools he needed to change the reality that was trying to hold him back. There is no doubt that in 1852, a young man born into slavery sat for a portrait in Savannah with a smile that people who saw it said looked like he was hiding something. The painting is gone, but the story of Elijah Brown keeps coming up, being told and retold, as if the man himself is making sure that his story is never finished. People who visit Savannah's historic district sometimes say they have a strange experience when they pass by the old Georgia Historical Society building, where the portrait was kept for many years. They feel like someone is watching them for a brief moment, as if they are taking their measure, writing down their reactions, and adding their notes to some ongoing calculation. The feeling goes away quickly, just long enough for them to look around and see what might be a young man with an unforgettable smile watching from a window or doorway that, when they look closer, doesn't have anyone in it. Curators in museums and galleries across the country have noticed a strange pattern. Paintings from the Antebellum period, especially portraits from the Savannah area, sometimes seem to have small changes when they are looked at again after being stored for a while. A shadow that wasn't there before, a background detail that seems to have moved, and a face that is only partially visible where there used to be a blank wall. People who work closely with the collections are always uneasy about these changes because they are small enough to be mistaken for mistakes in memory or record keeping, but consistent enough to be real. In 2024, a researcher who came to the Charleston Museum to look at the Harding family papers found a letter from the artist to his sister that had been missed before. It was written in October 1852, 6 months after he finished the portrait of Elijah Brown. Harding writes, "I can't work without constantly looking over my shoulder, sure that someone is watching me. What's even more disturbing is the growing feeling that my canvases are watching me too." I know this sounds crazy, but I swear to you that on 3 occasions now, I have found evidence that someone has changed my works in progress when the studio was locked and empty. Small changes to expressions, additions to backgrounds, and always that same face appearing where I had painted none. He sits for one portrait, and now seems determined to insert himself into all the others. The last paragraph of Harding's letter gives a very disturbing view of the case. I start to wonder if it was ever really my brush that made his likeness, or if I was just the tool he used to capture himself. Not as property to be displayed, but as an observer who would never again be stuck in a single frame. He watches now from everywhere and nowhere, having learned that portraits don't have to be prisons. They can be windows through which one might step, leaving behind only a smile that says, "I have found the way out." The original painting of Elijah Brown is still missing. The Georgia Historical Society keeps the empty crate that came to Atlanta in 1,964 inches its storage facility as part of the case's records. Sometimes, staff say they hear a sound coming from inside it. It's not the sound of a frame or canvas rattling, but something softer and more purposeful. Something that, as the night guard once wrote, sounds remarkably like someone smiling. Elijah Brown, who was born into a system that denied his humanity and treated him like property, may have found a unique way to be free, not by running north like so many others, but by finding a way to step between frames and go from being the observed to being the observer. Maybe while trying to keep that practiced smile for the portrait Winston had made, he learned something about how representation works, how an image can be more than just a record and become a doorway. Or maybe, as some people think, the story of Elijah Brown and his missing portrait is just a strange footnote in history that has grown more mysterious over time than it really is. The portrait may be sitting in a private collection where it is not very interesting to anyone who doesn't know its history. Elijah may have just escaped or died, like so many others who were born into slavery during that dark time in American history. No matter what the truth is, the story of the portrait of the smiling boy who was born a slave keeps coming back, and each new generation of researchers finds it again. And visitors to galleries and museums all over the country sometimes say that when they look at antebellum portraits, they feel like one of the faces in the frames is not just preserved in paint, but is also watching, recording, and calculating, still smiling the same knowing smile that Winston made him practice, but now on his own terms. Not the subject anymore, but the observer. Not stuck in one place, but able to move from frame to frame and from past to present, making sure that his story, like his gaze, never stays in one place.